"Take me with you," the obese girl begged the mountain man as she left her cruel stepmother behind. The winter of 1823 descended upon Dakota Territory with a cruelty that seemed almost personal. Snow fell in such thick, relentless sheets that the wagon ruts between homesteads disappeared entirely, leaving only an expanse of white that stretched endlessly toward a horizon obscured by perpetual clouds. The cold was the kind that found its way through every crack in a building's frame, the kind that made a person understand in their very bones why some folks chose not to survive it. The Hill homestead sat at the edge of Millbrook, a settlement that had sprouted up around a trading post some 15 years prior. It was a modest structure of rough-hewn logs, the gaps between them packed with mud and straw that had begun to deteriorate years ago. Smoke curled from the chimney in thin, apologetic wisps, as if the fire itself were too discouraged to burn with any vigor. Inside, Martha Hill knelt on the worn wooden floor, her broad back bent over the scrub bucket. Her hands, reddened and cracked from constant exposure to ice water and lye soap, moved in methodical circles across the planks. The work was endless and thankless, the kind of labor that seemed designed specifically to break a person's spirit by degrees. "Faster, you worthless creature!" The voice came sharp as a whip crack from the corner where Agatha Hill sat in the one comfortable chair the household possessed, positioned directly before the hearth. Agatha was a woman carved from bitterness, her face arranged in permanent lines of disapproval, her eyes always searching for fault. "At the rate you're moving, we'll be buried under snow before this floor is clean." Martha said nothing. Speech had become dangerous in this house. Any response, no matter how innocuous, could be twisted into an excuse for punishment, reduced rations, additional chores, or simply the harsh torrent of words that seemed to sustain Agatha's existence. The woman continued, addressing Martha's silent back. "Your father was a fool to die and leave me with you, and you, fat as you are, eating like 3 men, what man would ever want you? You're fortunate I allow you shelter at all. Most would have turned you out to the wolves by now." Martha's hand stilled for just a moment in the soapy water. She was 24 years old, and she had heard variations of these sentiments nearly every day since her father had passed 5 years earlier. She could no longer quite remember what her voice sounded like when it wasn't subdued. She could no longer quite remember what it felt like to be addressed with anything resembling kindness. Her father, Samuel Hill, had been a good man, not perfect, but decent in the way that mattered. He had married Agatha when Martha was 19, a decision Martha had understood as loneliness rather than romance. She had welcomed a stepmother, had even harbored hope that the household might feel less empty. Instead, 3 months after the wedding, Samuel had taken ill with pneumonia. Within a week, he was gone. The will left everything to Agatha, with a notation that Martha would be cared for. That care had manifested as unpaid servitude, constant belittlement, and the slow erosion of Martha's sense of self. There were days when she could barely recognize the woman she had become, this silent, invisible creature who existed only to serve. The only place Martha allowed herself to dream was in her small attic room at night, lying on her thin mattress under threadbare quilts, staring at the frost-covered window. She dreamed of places she had never been, of situations where her face and body were not sources of shame, of conversations where she mattered. In these dreams, She was valued. In these dreams, she was loved. As afternoon approached, Martha heard the sound of hoofbeats outside, unusual enough in winter to merit her attention. She glanced toward the window, but could see nothing through the thick frost. Agatha, however, brightened considerably. "Someone's come," she announced, as if Martha were not already aware. "Likely that mountain man, Caleb Stone. He comes this time of year with his furs." She straightened her already rigid posture. "You stay in the back. I'll not have him see you looking like that dirty and slovenly." Martha was already preparing to retreat when Caleb Stone entered, bringing with him a gust of wind and a presence that seemed to fill the entire small space. He was a large man, perhaps 40 years of age, with a full beard that had gone mostly gray and eyes the color of winter sky. His clothes were constructed of hide and fur, worn and weathered by years of use, and he carried with him the scent of wood smoke and distance. "Mornin', Agatha," he said, his voice a deep rumble. "Brought you some elk meat and fresh hides. Looking for flour, salt, and coffee, if you got it to spare." It was then that Martha, in the process of quietly leaving to the back room, stumbled slightly under the weight of an armload of firewood. She caught herself against the doorframe, her broad body momentarily silhouetted in the firelight. Caleb Stone's eyes, briefly and without seeming intent, found her. He took in the scene. A young woman clearly worn down, a stepmother clearly comfortable with cruelty, the unmistakable power dynamics of exploitation. He said nothing, but something shifted in his expression, a tightening around the eyes, a slight compression of his jaw. "That's just Martha," Agatha said dismissively. "My stepdaughter. She's more burden than help, if I'm honest. Eats like 3 farm hands and moves like a 3-legged ox." Caleb's gaze lingered for another moment. Then he turned back to his business. "That's generous of you to house her, all the same." "Generosity?" Agatha laughed, a sound like gravel in a wooden box. "It's obligation, nothing more. But let's discuss the trade, shall we?" Martha retreated to the back room, her heart beating strangely in her chest. She had seen Caleb Stone perhaps a half-dozen times over the years he had been trading in the territory. She knew he was a man who lived alone in the high country, that he came to town only when necessary, that he seemed to have chosen a life of solitude. She had never exchanged more than a polite greeting with him, yet today, for reasons she could not quite articulate, she found herself returning to the main room as soon as Agatha was distracted with tallying flour weights. She stood just inside the doorway to the kitchen, pretending to organize supplies on a shelf. The conversation between Agatha and Caleb was the standard negotiation of frontier commerce quantities and values, the relative worth of furs against staples. But Martha found herself watching Caleb's hands as he handled the trade goods, noting the competence and gentleness of his movements. He was careful with the flour sack, respectful of its contents. He seemed to treat commerce as an exchange between equals, not as an opportunity to dominate. Eventually, he finished his business and began to leave. As he moved toward the door, he passed close enough to Martha that she could see the details of his weathered face more clearly, the lines of a life lived outdoors, the weight of years lived alone. He paused. For just a moment, he looked directly at her. "Those are rough hands for such a young woman," he said quietly, his eyes moving from her face to her damaged hands, the skin raw and bleeding in places. "Winter work?" Martha glanced back toward where Agatha was counting coins, distracted. She hesitated, then whispered, "Year-round work." Something in Caleb's expression deepened. He nodded slowly, then turned and left, the door closing behind him with a heavy thud. Martha stood for a long moment, staring at the closed door, her heart still hammering in her chest. She had no logical reason for the surge of hope that rose in her, no reason to believe that the brief attention of a stranger meant anything at all. But it was enough to make her dream differently that night, not of abstract places, but of the high country, of solitude shared with someone who did not despise her. 3 days later, on an afternoon when the snow was falling so thickly that the world seemed to exist in white unreality, Martha stood on the back porch chopping wood. The work was endless and brutal, her fingers already numb despite the gloves, the ache in her shoulders a constant reminder of her body's weakness. Or so Agatha insisted it was weakness rather than simple exhaustion. She was so absorbed in the repetitive motion of the axe that she nearly missed the approach of the horse until it was nearly upon her. She looked up to find Caleb Stone, dismounted, moving toward her with deliberate purpose. "Mr. Stone," she said, surprised, straightening the axe. "I didn't expect—" "Is your stepmother inside?" he asked without preamble. Martha nodded slowly. "She's by the fire. She always is." Caleb seemed to consider something internally. Then he turned to face Martha directly, and his eyes held an intensity that made her breathing shallow. "Martha Hill, I have a question for you, and I need you to answer me with complete honesty. No embellishment, no politeness, just the truth. Can you do that?" Martha's mouth had gone dry. "Yes, sir. Do you want to leave here?" The question hung in the air between them like a physical thing. Martha felt as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted. This was not a polite inquiry. This was something else entirely. She began, then stopped. The truth was trapped in her throat, fighting against years of training that had taught her to accept her circumstances, to complain to no one, to endure in silence. "The truth, Martha Hill," Caleb repeated, his voice steady. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, every day, every moment of every day." Caleb nodded, as if she had confirmed something he had already suspected. "And if I told you I could take you away from here now, today, would you come?" Martha's mind reeled. This was impossible. It was too dramatic, too sudden. It was the sort of thing that happened in the stories she told herself, not in actual reality. "I have nothing to offer you in return," she said, her voice shaking. I'm not what you'd want. I can't even—" "I didn't ask you that," Caleb interrupted. "I asked if you would come. Would you?" Martha looked back toward the house, where she could see Agatha's silhouette through the window, sitting in her chair. She thought of the countless days stretching before her, the endless cycle of labor and belittlement, the slow death of everything in her that was not purely utilitarian. "Yes," she said, "yes, I would come, but I have no things. I have nothing prepared." "We don't have time for preparation," Caleb said. He was already moving, pulling her toward the horse. "We need to leave now, while the snow is thick enough that our trail will be covered. Go inside and get whatever is yours, no more than you can carry in one hand. 5 minutes, Martha Hill." Martha stood frozen for a moment, unable to quite process the sudden shift in her reality. Then, acting on pure instinct, she dropped the axe and moved toward the house. Agatha was still seated by the fire when Martha entered. "What are you doing in here? I didn't summon you." "I'm leaving," Martha said. The words sounded strange in her own ears, firm and clear, as if they belonged to someone else entirely. Agatha's face transformed into pure outrage. "What did you say?" "I'm leaving," Martha repeated. She was already moving up the narrow stairs to the attic. Her possessions were meager. 2 additional shifts, the few letters her father had written before she was born, a small carved bird he had made for her when she was young. She wrapped these in the one spare shawl she owned, knotting it into a bundle. Below, she could hear Agatha's voice rising, her footsteps heavy on the stairs. "You ingrate, you worthless, ungrateful creature, after everything I've done for you, you'll not survive a week out there, you'll come crawling back, and when you do, I'll see you cast into the street with nothing." Martha descended the stairs at a run, clutching her bundle. Agatha reached for her, but Martha dodged past with an agility she hadn't known she possessed, driven by something primal and self-preserving. She burst out into the snow where Caleb was waiting with the horse. He took the bundle from her, secured it to the saddle, and then lifted her up with surprising gentleness, despite her size, seating her solidly in front of him. "Hold to the saddle," he instructed, and then they were moving, plunging into the white storm. For hours they rode. Martha had no sense of direction, no awareness of where they were heading. The world had narrowed to the horse beneath them, the snow surrounding them, and the warmth of Caleb's body at her back. Her entire life, everything she had known, was disappearing into the white. Agatha's voice continued in her mind, all the predictions of failure and misery, but beneath those echoes was something new, a small, fragile hope. She was no longer in that house. She was no longer under Agatha's control. As night fell, Caleb guided the horse toward a rock overhang, a natural shelter barely visible through the snow. He helped Martha down, and she found her legs unsteady from cold, exhaustion, or emotion she couldn't determine. "We'll shelter here for the night," he said, already moving to gather wood and build a fire. "Tomorrow, if the storm passes, we'll head for higher ground." Martha stood watching him work, his movements economical and sure. "Mr. Stone," she said quietly, "why did you come back for me?" Caleb paused in his work, looking up at her. In the growing firelight, his face looked older, weathered by more than just the elements. "I spent 30 years trying not to care about anything," he said finally. "People, places, futures, all seemed like complications I didn't need. I told myself that was wisdom, that detachment was strength." He returned to building the fire, "But I'm old enough now to know that's just another word for loneliness, and I'm old enough to recognize cruelty when I see it. So when I saw you, I recognized something else too. I recognized the kind of endurance that deserves better than to be wasted on serving someone's hatred." He built up the fire into a proper blaze, and Martha felt its warmth reaching her for the first time in hours. Caleb pulled a heavy blanket from his pack, draping it around her shoulders. "Sit by the fire," he instructed. "I'll have some warm food ready soon." The journey to Caleb's cabin took 4 days. The storm broke on the second day, revealing a landscape so beautiful it nearly broke Martha's heart. Mountains rose in towering formations, their peaks silvered with snow, forests of evergreen stretching across valleys in waves of deep green and blue shadow. It was a landscape of vast indifference. Nature cared nothing for human suffering or human triumph, and somehow that indifference was comforting. Caleb proved to be a patient guide. He taught Martha how to ride properly, adjusting the saddle to accommodate her body, showing her how to shift her weight to to make the horse's job easier. He prepared hot food each evening, simple but nourishing. Soups made from dried vegetables and meat, bread baked on a stone beside the fire, strong coffee that seemed to contain the warmth of the entire world. On the second night, as they sat by the fire, Martha asked him about his life in the mountains. "It's solitary," Caleb said, stirring the pot of soup. "I trap fur in the winter, hunt through the rest of the year, tend a small garden in summer. I read by firelight when I have books, which isn't often. I've become accustomed to silence." "Don't you get lonely?" Martha asked. Caleb considered the question seriously. "Yes, but I grew up in Philadelphia, in a household with 12 people in it. I learned that loneliness is not the absence of people. It's the absence of being known. You can be surrounded by people and still be profoundly alone. Out here, I'm at least free to not try any more." Martha understood this. She had been surrounded by people, by Agatha, by townspeople, and had been utterly, completely alone. "Will you show me how to do things?" she asked. "The gardening and the cooking and whatever else you do? I don't want to be useless." Caleb set down his spoon and looked at her with an expression of such gentleness that it made her throat tighten. "Martha Hill, you are not and have never been useless. But yes, I will absolutely show you. If you want to learn, I'll teach you everything I know." When they finally arrived at Caleb's cabin on the 4th day, Martha felt as though she had crossed into another world entirely. The structure was small but sturdy, built with care into a sheltered valley where a stream ran year-round and towering pines provided windbreak. It was not grand, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. "It's modest," Caleb said, as if apologizing, "but it's warm and it's secure. You'll be safe here." He gave her a tour of the interior, a main room with a fireplace and hearth, a small bedroom off to the side, shelves lined with books and supplies, a table where he apparently worked on his traps and studied his maps and journals. Everything was organized with the precision of someone who lived alone and kept his own counsel. "Where will I sleep?" Martha asked. "In the bedroom," Caleb said. "I'll stay out here by the fire." Martha opened her mouth to argue the man had just saved her life. The least she could do was not displace him. But something in his expression suggested that this was not negotiable. The first days were strange and disorienting. Martha woke in the small bed, the sound of Caleb moving quietly about the cabin just beyond the door, and for a moment each morning she would panic this couldn't be real, this freedom couldn't actually be hers. Then she would hear the birds outside, smell the wood smoke, and remember she was safe. Caleb began teaching her immediately. He showed her how to tend the root cellar, checking for spoilage and organizing for maximum preservation. He taught her to bake bread properly in the cast iron ovens beside the fire, adjusting for altitude and wood type. He showed her his garden plot, preparing her for spring planting, explaining which herbs grew well in this climate and how to preserve them. Most importantly, he taught her by example what it meant to be treated with respect. He asked for her opinions on meals. He thanked her for her work. He addressed her as an equal in conversation, interested in her thoughts about books they read together and decisions about the household. 3 weeks into her stay, as they sat by the fire one evening, Martha asked the question that had been building inside her. "Why?" she said. "Why are you being kind to me?" Caleb looked up from the trap he was mending. "I'm treating you as you deserve to be treated. Why would that require explanation? Because no one has ever— Martha couldn't finish the sentence. Because no one has ever treated me like I matter. Because I don't know what to do with kindness. Because I'm terrified I'll wake up and this will all have been a dream. Caleb set down his work and moved to sit beside her. Martha, I think you've been convinced that you are less than for so long that you can't quite believe anyone would treat you otherwise. So let me be very clear. You are valuable. Your life has value. Your existence is enough. You don't have to earn kindness by being useful or compliant or thin or perfect. You exist, and that is enough. Martha felt something break open inside her, not in a damaging way, but like a frozen place finally thawing. Tears came, years of them it seemed, pouring out in great heaving sobs that she could barely control. Caleb didn't try to stop her or comfort her with platitudes. He simply sat beside her, occasionally handing her a handkerchief, letting her cry until the storm passed. That winter was unlike anything Martha had ever experienced. The snows came thick and deep, and the world narrowed to just the two of them and the mountain. But instead of feeling trapped, as she might have expected, Martha felt held. She felt safe. She learned to shoot with Caleb's rifle not perfectly, but competently. She learned to set snares and check traps, to butcher game and preserve meat. She learned the names of the stars and the habits of the animals that lived around them. She learned that her body, far from being the burden Agatha had insisted it was actually quite strong and capable when given work that mattered. And she learned that Caleb Stone was a man of deep quiet and even deeper kindness. She learned that he had been for so long so thoroughly alone that he had forgotten what it felt like to matter to someone. One evening in late February, as they sat by the fire, Caleb said, "The spring will come soon. You'll want to decide what you want to do. I won't keep you here if you want to move on to find a settlement or family or whatever calls to you. I brought you here to give you a choice, not to trade one form of captivity for another." Martha, who had been afraid of this moment, found the answer clear within her. "I want to stay. If you'll have me, I want to stay right here." "For how long?" Caleb asked carefully. Martha met his eyes. "For as long as you'll have me. For always, if I'm being honest." Caleb reached out and took her hand, his weathered fingers folding around hers. "Then let's talk about that. I'm an old man, Martha, and I've got no illusions about that. But I'm also a man who has learned something important about happiness. And I think I might be happy with you, if you'd want that." "I want that," Martha said simply. "I want that more than I've ever wanted anything." They were married by a traveling preacher who came through in May, bringing the letter of intention and the spoken vows beneath the great open sky. It was a small ceremony, just the two of them, the preacher and the mountains as witnesses. Martha wore a dress she had sewn from wool she had dyed and carded herself, and Caleb wore a shirt that Martha had mended and improved. It was perfect. That summer and fall, they worked together to expand the cabin slightly, building an additional room so that guests could be accommodated. Because Caleb, it turned out, had friends mountain men like himself, and also traders and missionaries who knew him from his years in the territory. Word had spread that he had taken a wife, and many people wanted to meet her and see if she was real or some elaborate story. Martha found herself unexpectedly social. The visitors brought news from the settlements, and though she felt no desire to return to Millbrook, it was pleasant to hear of the wider world. She and Caleb prepared meals for their guests, and Martha discovered that she enjoyed the interchange and the sharing. Life in the mountains was not easy. Winters were brutal, and supplies could run short. Martha learned to manage limited resources with an ingenuity born of necessity. She also learned, for the first time, what it meant to work hard for something she actually wanted rather than something she was forced to do. The difference was absolute. In the spring of 1825, Martha gave birth to a son. The birth was difficult, and there was a terrible moment when Martha thought she might not survive it, that she would be stolen away just when life had finally become worth living. But she did survive, and she held in her arms a perfect small human, a boy with Caleb's grave eyes and a full head of dark hair. They named him Samuel, after Martha's father. Caleb looked at his son with an expression of such wonder that Martha understood he had never quite believed he would have this. He held the baby with surprising competence, and Martha realized he must have helped at other births, with neighbors, or perhaps with animals. "He's beautiful," Caleb whispered. "He's perfect." Martha reached out and touched her husband's face. "We made him together," she said. "We did," Caleb agreed. "We made this together, a home, a family, a life that neither of us thought we'd have." Over the next several years, 2 more children followed, a daughter named Catherine in 1827 and another son, William, in 1829. The cabin grew louder, fuller, more chaotic in the best possible way. Martha found that motherhood suited her in a way that servitude never could. These children were hers in the way that nothing had ever been hers before, and she loved them with a fierceness that sometimes frightened her. Caleb was a devoted father. He taught the children to read and write, to understand the natural world, to live with integrity and kindness. He taught them by example how to treat a woman with respect, how to build things with their hands, how to find joy in simple pleasures. When Samuel was 4 years old, Agatha Hill died. The news came via a trader passing through in the autumn of 1829. She had contracted influenza and had perished without any family at her bedside. Martha felt a complicated grief, not for Agatha herself, but for the woman her stepmother might have been if life and bitterness hadn't shaped her so fundamentally. She decided to reach out to her half-siblings, Agatha's children, from a previous marriage, writing letters inviting them to visit. The letters took months to reach them, traveling by various routes and hands, but eventually responses came. Martha's half-sister, Elizabeth, was the first to visit. She came with her own family in the summer of 1830, skeptical and somewhat horrified at Martha's choice to live in the wilderness. But by the time they left 3 weeks later, Elizabeth had been won over. She had watched Martha live, had seen the genuine happiness in her face, and had held her nieces and nephews with tears in her eyes. "You're so much brighter than I remember," Elizabeth told Martha as they said goodbye. "When Father died and Agatha took over, you seemed to fade. I remember wanting to help you and not knowing how. I'm so glad you found your way here." Martha's brother James visited the following year, bringing his wife and newborn son. James was a man of business, somewhat practical and skeptical of emotion, but even he was moved by what Martha and Caleb had built. He brought supplies, good quality cloth, coffee, sugar, and promised to send more regularly. The mountain home became a gathering place, though it remained remote and somewhat isolated. But the isolation no longer felt like punishment. It felt like choice. Martha and Caleb had chosen this place, chosen each other, chosen to build a life that was theirs and no one else's. Martha's body, which Agatha had made her hate, became something she could be neutral about, even occasionally proud of. It was strong enough to carry children, to do the work of survival, to climb mountains and swim in the stream. It was a body that worked, and that was enough. By the time Samuel was old enough to remember, he had no awareness that his mother had ever been anything but valued and beloved. He and his siblings grew up in a household where they were fed well, educated, and told regularly that they were loved and that their existence mattered. They grew up understanding that strength and kindness were compatible, that women's work was essential and worthy, that a man could be powerful and gentle at the same time. One evening in 1835, when Martha was 36 years old and Caleb was 52, they sat together on the porch of the expanded cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Their 3 children were inside with a visiting trading friend, playing cards and telling stories. "Do you have regrets?" Martha asked. It was a question she occasionally asked, needing to check that Caleb didn't feel he had made a mistake in his choice. Caleb reached over and took her hand. "Not a single one." "You?" Martha thought about her life, the years of servitude, the moment in the snow when Caleb had asked if she wanted to leave, the journey up the mountain, the children, the quiet contentment of building a home. "No," she said, "no regrets. Everything that came before led me to this moment right now with you. So even the painful part seemed necessary." "That's wisdom," Caleb said. "Hard-won wisdom." Martha squeezed his hand. "Do you remember what you told me that first night by the fire, that you had spent 30 years learning to be alone?" "I do," Caleb said. "Well, you got the last 15 years to learn something different," Martha said. "You got to learn how to not be alone, how to let someone love you." "I did," Caleb agreed, "and it was the best education I ever received." They sat in silence as the light faded and the first stars appeared. Inside the cabin, they could hear laughter, their children's voices bright and clear, the sound of human connection and family. Martha thought about the girl she had been, kneeling on the floor in Agatha's house, believing that she deserved nothing better, that her body was wrong and her very existence was a burden. That girl seemed like someone else entirely now, a stranger from another lifetime. She was Martha Stone now, wife of Caleb, mother of 3, builder of homes and teller of stories. She was a woman who read books by firelight, who grew herbs for medicine, who delivered babies when neighboring settlements called for help. She was a woman who mattered. And it had all begun with a simple question on a snowy afternoon. "Will you come with me?" The answer to that question had changed everything.